Okay. Hi, my name is Michael Kauper, and I was the first man to be licensed for doing family child care in a home in Minnesota. Last week, my business partner of over 40 years, Marian Turner, died. We were the Turner and Kauper Family Child Care Home. And this video is to celebrate the life and death of Marian Turner. And the reason that I want to celebrate both her life and her death is because being a child care provider the government drove Marian to an early death. And that's a very strong and inflammatory thing to say, but I have a lot of good reasons for why I'm saying it. And in this video, I want to tell you about why we love doing daycare, why it was such a passion for us, and what it is that happened to us, and try to tell you that it's happening to a lot of other families and family child care providers and children, that there's a great deal of very unfortunate stuff happening here in Minnesota and in especially Hennepin County. And for Marian's sake, for my sake, and literally because of how we've seen children and child care providers suffering, I want this video to be a celebration of Marian's life and of her death. They're both going to be important here. And it's hard to think where to start. When Marian was a little girl, she really wanted to take care of children. She knew that when she grew up, she wanted to have a group of kids that she took care of by herself, because in her neighborhood, she was a caregiver. She was the one who organized the other children in games. Everyone who's around children sees this, the kids playing teacher, the kids playing mommy. And Marian knew that for her career, that's what she wanted to be. And she and I got to know each other while we were in our late teens. And I was a student over at the University of Minnesota studying physics, and then a graduate student. And one of my colleagues at the University of Minnesota, his wife was a family child care provider. She was significant in that her name was Mary. Mary and her daycare children decided that family child care should be more official in Minnesota than it had been up to that time. She wanted more respect and more government recognition. And so Mary took her children. She couldn't get it by calling, and she couldn't get it by visiting the Department of Human Services. So she took her daycare children down to the offices of the Department of Human Services every day for a week and had lunch in the place that they told her that she could wait. They wouldn't let her in to see the commissioner, so she took her daycare kids down there, and they ate basically in his lobby. And they were allowed to do that. They didn't want to be seen being mean to kids, I guess. And eventually, he spoke to her, and he agreed that he was going to make licensing in Minnesota a more formal affair. And then Marian heard about this, and she got a daycare license. I went with her to the licensing meetings. There were many things that you had to do to qualify. You had to go to these introductory meetings and learn what the business was like. You had to take a lengthy course in CPR and a lengthy course in first aid and a bunch of child development classes, all of which we thought was great. And she got her daycare started. Her first daycare child in 1971 was a Muslim child. He was Zevin Farouk Frostad. And her second daycare child was Marshall Schrago. He was Jewish. And her third daycare child was Anyanya Matimba. Anyanya's dad was a black man from a black man from England, very well spoken, very highly educated. And he was a fan of some freedom fighters who were fighting against colonialism in North Africa, and they were called the Anyanya. depending on the politics, which I was hardly aware of at the time, some called them freedom fighters, some called them terrorists. I heard them called the League of Assassins, which is sort of a romantic thing. But the dad was, he thought they were an amazing group fighting for freedom and on the right side of justice. And that's what he named his son. We had Anyanya, and then later his sister Nika came along. I don't know what happened to Zevin Farouk. He moved to California and we lost track of him after about 20 years. Marshall was interviewed in another video celebrating Marian. Marshall has lived all over the world, and he had a lot of nice things to say about her in the other video, so I won't go there. Nika lives in Minneapolis, and she has a child, and she's still in touch with the daycare. And she just recently posted on Facebook how she still really likes astronomy and science and mathematics. And I don't know if we can take the credit for it, but she gives us the credit for her love of math and science and astronomy and for what she's teaching her children. In the daycare, along with those 3 kids, eventually, of course, lots more children came along. Marshall's father was a professor of education at the University of Minnesota, and when he left the university, he directed the Rutland program for special needs children for the St. Paul school system. Marshall's mother was the vice president of Minnesota Now, the national organization for women. But at the same time, very soon after Marshall started in the daycare, we got Hillary, and then her younger brother was born into the daycare. And Hillary's parents her dad was the last Republican president of the Minneapolis City Council. And her mom, now I may not have this correct, but I know she was a significant officer in the Minnesota Republican Party. I believe that at that time she was the president of the Minnesota Republican Party. So along with the Islamic child and the Jewish child and the freedom fighter child, we also had the president of the Republican Party and the Republican president of the Minneapolis City Council. Then we had Mark Dayton and his wife Elida. Mark, of course, was running for the Senate at that time, and his wife was the Minnesota Philanthropist of the Year. She gave a lot of money especially to women's organizations, to Ms. and to Now, and she started Chrysalis. She fully funded Chrysalis for many, many years. She gave a lot of money to Planned Parenthood. And Marian had a very clear, strong personality, and everyone respected her to an unbelievable extent. Just being around her, they immediately respected her and respected her wishes. And it was just like magic. It would happen 2 seconds after people met her. So the daycare was completely neutral territory. The only thing people were worried about when they were here was the kids and what we did. And that's what we worked on and talked about with this very diverse group of parents. Let me see some more parents that we had here. We had the Minnesota Entrepreneur of the Year elected by the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce. And his wife was a family psychologist, and he did manufacturing in Minnesota and attempted to go head to head with what was then the emerging manufacturing from China. So he was one of the first people to deal with Chinese competition. We also had Marg Jade in our family daycare home. Marg Jade was the first person, she brought the first highly successful lawsuit in Minnesota based on Title 20. And Title 20 was the federal law that gave equal rights and equal protection to girls in school, and particularly to girls' athletics. So one of our daycare kids, and we greatly supported her in this, she loved playing soccer, and at school she told the soccer coach that her name was Mark, and she dressed like a boy so that she could play soccer. When they found out she was a girl, they kicked her out. So she sued, she won, and she's responsible for, she and lots of people who supported her and lots of other people who fought for girls and women. But she was the key person in getting equality in sports at all levels, up through the university level, for girls here in Minnesota. And I'm very happy to say that, she was one of our daycare kids, and we loved her. We also had Jessica and Joanna. Jessica and Joanna's mom was also a philanthropist. She was a daughter of the Onan family, started a lot of good things here in Minnesota. I think she was big in helping Minnesota Public Radio get their start. And because I took her daughters on lots of daycare camping trips, and we used telescopes, and I taught them to find their way around the night sky, Mary gave the Minnesota Astronomical Society their first really big grant. In our daycare, whenever there was something happening up in the sky, we would go and observe it. The parents were wonderful. I would tell them, we're going to be watching the lunar eclipse from the west shore of Lake Harriet. And soon I would have a dozen daycare parents and a whole bunch of children and the children's friends from school. They would all gather. We would have telescopes and binoculars, and the moon would rise to the east of us, which was why we were on the west shore, so that we could see all the way across the lake, so that you could see the moon when it was very low in the sky, and the moon would rise, and the kids would run around, and we would have snacks and refreshments. And it was a great way to experience the sky, and they would watch these lunar eclipses. And later on, the children remembered this. I've gotten quite a few emails and Facebook posts over the years from kids who say, yes, it was in your daycare home that we learned to love astronomy, or that we learned to love planting flowers and digging up worms, and we really liked your cool microscope. The daycare bought a stereo microscope, which is the best way to introduce children to the world of the small, because in the stereo microscope, things are only magnified a moderate amount. You can still recognize what you're looking at. It's not like a scientist in a laboratory. You can see the thing that you're looking at, but with incredible detail, and it's three-dimensional. And so the children were able to both relate to what they were looking at and step into a new world, see snowflakes as three-dimensional structures made out of these amazingly thin bars of ice, and then watching the snowflakes melt. We would bring the microscope out into the backyard and catch snowflakes on it, and then look at them. And we had Emily Barbatsis, and her mom was an audiologist. In fact, Eric Dayton was in our child care at that time, and we had a program of taking the children down to see their parents at work. And just by coincidence, real story, Eric was invited into the audio booth, and Emily's mom, the audiologist, discovered that he had a hearing deficiency, which his parents then were able to correct by getting him the ear tubes that dried out his inner ears and helped the drainage. So if I hadn't brought the kids to their parents, his pediatrician, his school, none of them had found out that he had this hearing loss. But this other daycare parent did. And Emily's dad was the dean of students at the University of Minnesota. And he used to really love telling us how much better behaved the daycare kids were than the students at the University of Minnesota. Actually, that's not such a big deal. It's really not at all surprising that our daycare kids were better behaved. going to the university, especially a big liberal arts college, you're supposed to go a little bit nuts, but he did like saying that the 4-year-olds were much more mature than the 18-year-olds. We also had Katrina and Christina, Katie and Kika, and their mom was, she had her doctorate in public health, and she helped to get early healthcare systems started here in Minnesota. And her dad was a vice president at the University of Minnesota. And after he left the University of Minnesota, he became a very significant person in Minnesota and later on in Boston, Massachusetts, at establishing public housing. That became his passion, at building public housing that would last and that was respectful and that would give people a leg up to a better future. He was from Germany, a German immigrant. And I have a couple more people to brag about, and then I'm going to tell you why I'm bragging about all of them. We had a professor of geology. We had a professor of pediatric medicine. He was the chair of I don't know the proper words that the university would use, but basically his department was responsible for teaching the pediatricians that we have here in Minnesota. He was the chair of the department of something like pediatric education. And he really liked coming to the daycare. He had 3 kids in our daycare, and he really liked coming to the daycare and talking about children's health. And his favorite topic for me and Marian was old wives' tales. And he claimed that old wives' tales often have a basis in fact, and his favorite stories were the stories where the old wives were right and the doctors and the scientists were wrong. Because for an example would be that the child care providers and all of the old wives universally believed that diaper rash was associated with teething. And the pediatricians said, no, that's not possible. Teething has nothing to do with diaper rash. And he asked our opinion about this, and we talked about it, and we said we had to agree with the old wives' tale. And we came up with this theory. I mean, it was mostly his, of course, but we came up with this theory that these same enzymes which dissolve the gums and make it possible for the baby teeth to pop through were the enzymes that would pass through the child and dissolve their butt and give them diaper rash. So there was Emma and Anna and Katrina. Their mom, Nina, Emma, Anna, and Katrina, it kind of trips off the tongue. Their mom, Nina, worked with the school system. She also had a doctorate in public education, and she worked with the school system settling Hmong refugees. And to this day, 40 years later, we have the most beautiful Hmong art hanging on our walls that came to us through Nina and through people, immigrants would visit our daycare, and we would go to their events. I remember being the only European person with a whole bunch of daycare children over at the Hmong festival in St. Paul, in the place where we still play hockey, the energy center over there. It was either that place or the place that was just before it. It was a gigantic indoor space, and the Hmong people were very polite to us and very friendly, and they kept trying to feed us, and it was very nice being there. But we got a lot of sidelong looks, like, what is this old, this white guy with a long beard doing with all of these very white children and a couple of black children at the Hmong festival? But the children liked it. They remembered it. We bought music on cassettes. You guys don't know what cassettes are, but it was a way of reproducing music. And we bought the Hmong music, and the children listened to it and enjoyed it, and it was definitely different from what they would have heard in another setting. And the dad of these three girls was a doctor. He was on the board of medical ethics at the University of Minnesota, and he was credited with founding SHARE, Minnesota's first HMO, and he eventually became the medical director for Health Partners, a little company that's still operating here in Minnesota. And he was responsible, did I just mess up the mic? I'm sorry. He was responsible for making sure that me and Marian had health care, because those first years, I mean, we were taking care of children who, teachers and graduate students and nurses and people who didn't have very much money at all. Oh, one of Minnesota's first male nurses was in our family daycare home. I thought that was pretty great too. But he was responsible for making sure that we had health care, because we earned $4,000 a year and $5,000 a year and $6,000 a year. The daycare was around for more than 10 years before we broke $10,000 a year, and that was before taxes. And something that people out there might be interested in knowing is, if you are a family child care provider working out of your own home and self-employed, you pay 30 to 40% of your income out back in taxes. So I would make $10,000 in my taxes, counting federal taxes, state taxes, sales tax, and property tax. My taxes were over $4,000 out of my $10,000. And the $6,000 that was left was for buying my medical care, my food, taking care of my house, vacations, everything that I needed to, be a self-sustaining, self-supporting person and run a daycare. So I wanted to talk about why people liked our daycare home so much. Part of it was because we were genuinely good child care providers. When Marian and I thought there was a lack in the training community, we would just do it ourselves. We were members of the national group that got nutrition labels onto food, and that won many, many lawsuits against the government for not protecting the quality of our food stream. I'm trying to remember the name, the Center for Science in the Public Interest. And we belonged to them, and we had like nutrition posters up on our wall. And this being the 60s and 70s, revolution and idealism was just in the air. It was just everywhere. We were going to make the world a better place. That was all part of protesting against the Vietnam War, which absolutely terrified everyone in my generation. And also, there are obviously lots and lots of strong feelings. And one of the ways that we coped with this fear and the difficulties presented to our society by the war was trying to be idealists. And one of those things was worrying about genetic manipulation of food and trying to get food that came directly from the farm. The first co-op in Minnesota, they would bring farm products